When I came to San Diego in 1961, it was to start a jewelry and metalsmithing program. I grew up in New York, and I went to Skidmore College in upstate New York. I went there for two reasons. One, it had a very good art department, and two, it was all women. And I was very young. I had just turned 17, and I sort of needed the comfort and self-confidence building of being in a women's environment, and it worked very well for me. I didn't study metal. I studied actually art education, which meant that I had to do a whole lot of different things, and I thought I was going to be a painter. But I promised my mother that I would be self-supporting, so I would become a teacher. But I wanted only to teach adults. I didn't wish to teach children. So I went directly to graduate school because I needed to have a master's degree in order to teach at the level I wished to teach. So I went immediately to the Midwest, to the university that gave me the most money to come, which was the University of Illinois. And I there studied with Arthur Poulos, who was a quite well-known silversmith. I hadn't worked in metal at Skidmore because they didn't have a metals program at the time. So I went to Urbana thinking that I was going to study painting. But after my first semester in class with a whole bunch of Army veterans who were older and much more talented than I realized I probably wasn't going to be a painter. But I was already working in the ceramics department and the metals department. Ceramics was never my field. I don't like it. I don't like the feel of clay under my fingers. And throwing on the wheel made me seasick. So that was definitely not going to be my field. But metal worked really well for me, and Arthur Poulos was a very good teacher, and I actually worked for him also in his studio. So that became my material of choice. I really felt comfortable working in metal, but I didn't have a lot of skill. So my first teaching job was at Wheaton College in Massachusetts, which happens to be near Taunton, which is the center of the jewelry trade. And so there were lots of people in the area who had workshops, private workshops. And I went knocking on doors to find somebody who would let me work in a workshop on my own things. And I met a very nice elderly gentleman who said, "Oh, sure, here's a key." So I worked there for 2 years and confirmed my interest in metal. So I decided to be really brave and apply for a Fulbright to go to Denmark, where I could study with jewelers and silversmiths. I also didn't have to speak Danish to apply. So I did receive that grant, and I spent a very profitable year in Copenhagen studying at the School of Arts and Crafts, as well as working in a private workshop, which is probably where I learned more than any place else. When I came back, I had a teaching job at Skidmore because when I applied for the Fulbright, I also applied for every job going because I wanted to move on. And Skidmore offered me a job, and then I got a Fulbright. So I called them up and said, "Guess what? I'm not coming." And they said, "That's all right, we'll wait," which is unheard of. So I certainly was very grateful for that. And I came back and decided that I really didn't want to continue in a sort of Danish mode, which was very simple forms, repetitive forms, very beautiful, but a little bit boring for me. My idea of jewelry had been fostered by my study at the Metropolitan Museum, my looking at Egyptian jewelry. So my idea about jewelry was not earrings and rings, it was collars and headpieces. And I decided that I would just go for it. So this is a piece that I made just when I moved to California in 1961. I looked in my in my scrap box, and there were all these wonderful shapes. And I thought, I really want to do something improvisational. I don't want to design it, I just want to make it. And I decided to use those little interesting shapes and think of them as flowers. So I made a series of garden pins where I simply made the form, made the setting, and then as mood struck me, I added the flowers out of my scrap box. This is probably the best one that I made of that series. It's about 3 inches across, so fairly large. And it was my introduction also to San Diego, because I had to go to the dentist, and this piece of ivory at the bottom had a crack that I didn't know what to do with. So I asked the dentist, and he fixed it for me. This piece belongs to the Renwick Gallery in Washington. In the second or third year I was in San Diego, I decided to make a trip through Central and South America because I really liked the gold work from ancient cultures in that part of the world. It wasn't until I looked at a map that I realized I was closer when I lived in New York than I was in San Diego. But I had also had the opportunity to meet Sheila Hicks, who's a weaver, and she had a show in La Jolla. I went and spoke with her, and she was very encouraging and invited me to Tasco, where she was living. And so that confirmed that I would go to Latin America. It was about a 2.5-month trip down through Central America, as far south as Peru, where I had the opportunity to see some wonderful gold jewelry that I hadn't seen before. A lot of the work in Central America is cast. And although I admired the forms and the motifs, casting has never been my thing. But when I got to Peru and saw these pieces where metal was sewn to fabric for ceremonial objects, mostly sort of big ponchos with little squares of gold sewn on them, I thought, what an interesting idea that was. And although that's been done in other cultures, and I had actually seen it before, it had never really struck me that that was something I could do. The form that you see here is actually based on a chimu pectoral. I did a lot of drawing from the collections that I looked at in South America, and this form recurs over and over again. So it seemed natural when I decided to sew metal onto cloth that I would also use that form. I constructed the bib, which is really what it is, out of velvet, and then made all the silver pieces. They're quite thin, about 26 gauge, so it doesn't weigh a great deal. And I pierced it for design purposes and then just simply sewed it on. I only made one piece like that because it occurred to me as I was doing it that I didn't have to sew on. I could actually make the fabric at the same time. I knew how to weave, and I could weave on a board, which I had learned from Sheila Hicks, that I could work small and I could work with fine threads. So I decided to simply do another bib, but one where I integrated the fabric and the metal. The warp is made of silk and linen, which are both very strong materials that I thought wouldn't be hampered by the metal. I made all the metal pieces separately and then simply wove them in as I needed them. It was woven on a board with nails to make the shape. Encouraged by that piece, I thought I would try it again, and this was done I was at Haystack teaching for a 3-week session, and I thought I might have time after hours to do some work. So I decided to do this very large piece. It's about, I put it on a 6-foot long plank. It goes over the shoulders, front and back, down a little below the waist. And the slide is not true. It's really shades of green. Haystack is covered with moss, most beautiful mosses, and I had no idea there were that many different kinds. but they're beautiful, and I was so taken with them that that's what inspired this piece. I had made all the metal parts before I went to Haystack, so I had all of those. I knew what the design was going to be, but I found all the yarns in the cupboard of the fiber studio at Haystack. They are artificial fibers. There's a saran. The element that you see going across the metal is saran, a very strong synthetic, and then I think the others were rayons. Needless to say, it didn't get anywhere near finished in 3 weeks. But I chose to use something called a sumac stitch, which is a little bit like embroidery. It takes forever. So something that I thought would be done in 3 weeks actually took about 6 months. I took it off the board, rolled it up, and brought it home, and made another board for the warp to be suspended. It was the first piece that I think that I showed that was this large in scale. And it was interesting that people always would ask me, well, do you wear it? And I said, well, I could. I have to have the right occasion. And I said, well, and they said, well, you'll need somebody tall and slender to wear it. And I thought, well, I don't know that that's true. Anyway, it eventually was purchased by someone whom I didn't know from a gallery, and she later contacted me and asked if she could come to my studio because she owned this piece, and I was very curious about, was she tall? But it turned out she was like 5'2". And she was a businesswoman, and I said, do you wear it? And she said, oh, absolutely. It makes me feel powerful. The 60s were a time of great promiscuity in clothing, and I was sitting in a faculty meeting, which was very boring, and drawing some shapes, and it looked to me like it could make a halter. So I made a pattern and decided to just go ahead and make it in silver. So the metal part is freestanding. It's hooked together on the skirt. It needed to have some weight at the bottom, and it also needed a bottom. So I bought some printed velvet fabric from Jack Larson and made this skirt, which is attached to the halter. You may have seen it. It was on view here. And I did wear it. That's me. When I was tall. So I knew when I made it that it probably wouldn't have fit very many people, but it fit me. And happily, it was acquired by the Museum of Art and Design. So nobody else got to wear it. But this is a full-length piece. I did 2. And these were in the late 60s. I was living in Copenhagen again on the second Fulbright, where I was a research person instead of a student. And that meant that I had my own workshop I rented from a silversmith, and he had the biggest chasing bowl I'd ever seen. It was like, I could hardly lift it. So I had the opportunity to make some very large elements for a full-length piece. They're made of 26 gauge silver, which would otherwise be a little bit too fragile, but I've curled all the edges and chased a good bit on it, so I've made the pieces much stronger and stiffer. I wanted to wear the piece, so I needed to think how would you wear it? And to go all the way to the ankle with those large elements was not practical. So instead I made miles of chain so that you could walk in the piece. And that's the back. Wow. Because I had learned from Egyptian jewelry that if you have a big thing in the front, you need a weight in the back to hold it. So this is the counterweight. And I did actually wear the two pieces, the two full-length pieces that I made. I was living in Copenhagen and loved to go to the opera and the ballet. And the Royal Theatre has this wonderful foyer where people promenade. So I promenaded. On a subsequent trip to Peru, I had seen in a private gold collection something I had not seen before, which was a little scrap of woven silver. Woven gold. It wasn't, I didn't know what it was from, but it was a little scrap. And I thought, well, I never thought about that. I'll bet I could do that. So I kept that in mind, and I was going to be living in London for a year and needed to have some things that I maybe wouldn't have a workshop to do. So I decided I would proceed with this weaving idea. The strip for it's a bracelet. The strip for the bracelet is fine silver because I thought it probably needed to be soft. I don't know that that was actually true, but at the time I thought it was. And so it's a strip of silver that I just cut with a scissor into strips. I didn't cut them apart. And then the weft is similar strips, but also forged wire elements, so it would be a little sturdier than just fine silver would be. And also tubes. I had this collection of macaw feathers that I knew I wanted to use, and I had to think, how would I do that? I didn't want to weave them in because I thought if they get broken, you won't be able to replace them. So I decided to put them into tubes. So the tubes are actually woven as part of the weft, and after it was all finished, I could put feathers in and simply glue them into the tubes. The catch, I really struggled with that. I wanted to have the macaw feathers color reproduced in the catch, and I tried everything. I tried turquoise, I tried amethyst, I tried sapphire. Nothing had that same quality of intense color. But I had been to Egypt, and I had these little mummy beads, which are faience, and they come in that exact color. So I made a little mosaic of the mummy beads for the catch. Fans became a really interesting form for me, and the idea that I could make something lighter weight by weaving it went together with that idea. So the body of the piece is actually woven silver and titanium, making it fairly lightweight. It is reversible. It's pink on this side, and turn it over, it's green, because titanium can be those two colors at certain voltages. It's a fairly large piece, about 5 inches, a brooch. But in order to, I had to sort of devise some kind of pin mechanism that wouldn't interfere with the weaving. Always thinking about working larger. I decided to do another fan. This is a woven piece. I found that I could buy strip metal that I didn't cut with a scissor. And there's a real advantage to that. When they're cut commercially, they're cut with a slitter, and it doesn't make sharp edges. So the edges of these strips are rounded and didn't have to be sanded. A big plus from my point of view. And I found a source for lots of different sizes. So the fan was woven from that source material. It is a functional fan. The part that goes around the neck unhinges at the collar. At the shoulder, you take it off and you use the back part as the handle. Okay. I did a project in platinum with the Platinum Guild of America, and they gave me the confidence to try something in platinum, and also a source for finding the material. This is a brooch. It's about 6 inches long, but it's springy, because the platinum is quite sturdy. It was woven flat on a board. I had learned from looking at the Peruvian things and trying weaving pieces, that turning the corner with a flat piece of metal is ugly. You don't get a nice turn unless you make this little picot edge, which you do just by folding. So the gold part is 18 karat. It's very sturdy. It can stretch out to a different size, or it can scrunch in to a different size. I did want to know if I could weave on a loom, and I had a loom, so I could try that. Again, I made some suppositions that weren't always true. I thought the warp, if I want to do a warp and string it on a loom, it better be really soft. So it's fine silver, and it better be really thin. So I think it's 30 gauge. And it was strung up just like thread. I mean, when you have wire that thin, it works like thread. You just have to be careful not to let it kink. The center part is a brooch and also the catch for the bracelet. So it hooks onto the bracelet with tubes, and the bracelet can come off and be worn separately, and the brooch can be worn separately as well. I knew that I couldn't ever solder things together with this weight metal. At least I wasn't capable of doing that without melting it. So everything is done mechanically. I either use rivets or I sew in order to make endings. In the early 80s, I decided I loved the fact that weaving on a loom let me make patterns. So this is a twill pattern. You can see it's slightly diagonal, sort of diamond shapes. And I also thought that I wouldn't have to have quite so many ends if they were flat instead of round, because they take up more space if they were flat. So I rolled all the round wire flat. So it was no longer round, it was a ribbon, but equally thin, and that's strung on a loom in a twill pattern, and then woven. It's a brooch. It's I think 3 inches square. It's held together. I mean, you wear it by taking one of those, taking one of the ends off and putting the pins through the hole in the middle, and then putting it back on. The advantage of working in 18 karat gold is I could solder. So the corners are all soldered. I love weaving in patterns. And I sold my big loom because it took up too much space. And it was too wasteful. If I was threading it with silver, I didn't want to have a whole lot of waste at both ends. So I switched to working with a table loom. And the maximum width that I could weave on the table loom was like 5 inches wide. I could make it any length, but only 5 inches wide. So I did a series of just pattern samples. I made them, for the most part, squares. And I made maybe 8 of them on a single warp, and then cut them apart and had pieces that I could make something out of. They weren't finished objects. And what I decided to make were scent containers, because weaving is porous, so you actually get a scent permeating out of it. These are, I did, I don't know, 8, I guess I did 8. The woven part is 5 inches high, but the whole piece, which is a pendant, is about 6. They're not heavy because of the weaving being the major part, but they do all open. And they have a sort of architectural character, and so I sort of emphasized that in this piece, which is a column. It's one of those woven samples, only this one had the round wire, so it's packed a little bit differently, and then just folded into a square cylinder. And the top and bottom added on. I decided I would be really brave and make a collar on my little table loom. So in order to do that, I knew that I had to have 3 feet of woven material. I had done a pattern, and I knew what I was going to do with it, that I was going to pleat it, so I knew that it had to be that long when it was finished weaving. So I simply strung that much warp on the loom, and then wove this piece, which is also in a diamond twill. It was woven as just a long rectangle, and then pleated on one side, and that's what made it round. To hold the pleats in place, I used little black onyx beads in between the pleats, and then under that staircase is the opening, is the fastening. It's just a hinge type fastening, but the staircase comes from my experience climbing a Mayan temple in Guatemala, which I thought was going to be my home forever, because it was too scary to come down. It was scary enough going up, but coming down was really bad. But I finally managed. At any rate, it's just a pleated gold piece that unhooks at the top and reveals the catch. Braiding is another textile technique that I explored. In the early 70s, I was having a show in New York, and a publisher came to the exhibition and said, "Would you like to write a book?" I said, "No." I mean, he had in mind, I think, a technical book about jewelry making, and I didn't need to do that. I'm not all that good, and other people had done really good books. So I said, "No, thank you." But when I got home, I thought, I've been playing around with these textile things, and there's nothing in print that I have found. I mean, I found little pieces of things mostly in archaeological books, but I hadn't found anything of an explanatory text about how to do this. So I called him back in New York and said, "I would do a book if you want this topic. I would be interested to do this topic because I really would like to learn a lot more." And we agreed. So I spent a year making all the samples and learning how to do most of the techniques that I didn't know how to do. One of them was braiding. This braid is called a zigzag braid, and it comes from a pre-Columbian source. I first made it as a gold piece, so the upper part is 18 karat, and it's quite springy because it's pleated after it's braided, but the metal has enough tension that it keeps its shape. But then I decided I would make a second necklace as a shadow. So the black part is oxidized silver, and it comes off if you choose not to wear that part. I learned from making that zigzag necklace that the only thing that determines a zigzag is a right angle. So every zig and zag is actually a right angle. And I thought, well, if I can make right angles, I don't have to make a zigzag, I could just make right angles. So I tried some paper patterns using right angle shapes to make large pieces. And the result of that was several pieces like this. They're braided, so they have quite a lot of flex to them. And they are in 2 pieces. It's two big right angles, one in the front, one in the back, fastened with hinges on the shoulders. And then the gold square is a brooch that simply adds a little color and excitement to the piece, but can also be worn separately. The pattern that you see was something I didn't know how to do, and I was at Haystack and looking through the library, and I found a book on twill braids. I mean, where else would you find a book like that? And so suddenly I knew how to do this, and I decided I would use that information, and I oxidized half of the pieces so they're black, and waxed them so they'd stay black, and then the other half so the pattern is more readily observed. What I didn't know when I made the first piece was that it would drape. And that was a surprise. I mean, I knew the paper drape, but I didn't know metal would drape. But after I had woven the first square, first right angle, I put it on a mannequin and voila, it did all these wonderful things that I didn't expect. So I made this second piece to sort of capitalize on that drape effect. And I think it only works because the structure is braided, which has a certain amount of flexibility that even a woven piece wouldn't have. I was a Girl Scout, so I knew, I knew about lanyards, and I knew about three-dimensional braids. So I decided to see what those would be like in metal, and they're fun because they wiggle. And I thought, well, what could I do with that? Well, I could make rings, and they would be fun to wear. So this is a family of rings. You're meant to wear all three. They're braided nickel and fine silver, and then the shanks are constructed of sterling and nickel. Knitting was something I did know how to do, and it was one of the early samples that I tried when I was researching the book. And what I learned, which I didn't know, was that if you increase the stitches a lot, there's no place for it to go, so it ruffles. And I thought, well, that's an interesting idea. I could make ruffles. And I made a smaller version of this in copper to see if it really did work. And I liked it, so I decided to bravely make a silver one. It's large, it goes out to the shoulders, and because it has so many stitches, it ruffles and it bounces. The outer edge is 18 karat to give it a little bit more strength on the edge. And then because it's quite heavy, it needed a band around the neck to keep it steady. So it's a woven band to which the knitting is sewn. And that's fine silver 30 gauge. What does it feel like? It feels like fun. It's very smooth because there are no edges, no ends. I mean, I learned...
It's not scratchy.
No. I learned that with fine silver, if you touch the end of the wire with a little tiny flame, it makes a little tiny ball that doesn't scratch. So all the, whatever ends there are melted in that way. But it does do this. I made several pieces like that. It rivets you to the place you're working in, because if you're making this piece, I don't use circular needles, I use double-pointed needles, so by the time I got out to the outer edge, I had about 30 double-pointed needles. So I stayed seated and I didn't move around. But that is sort of limiting, so I decided I should try doing it another way. And I was doing a lecture tour around Scotland, so I was on trains a lot, and I had these little tiny spools of colored wire that I had bought. I hate to name drop, but I had bought them in Tasmania because I found them, and I thought they were such pretty colors. So I decided to just take a piece of a pattern, and the piece was a leaf. So these are leaf shapes picked out of a bigger knitting pattern, and they're each knitted separately on little tiny knitting needles. And I could do that on the train. And I just kept pushing them into a bag. And when I got back to London in my studio, I threaded them onto one long needle. And then I knitted up to make the collar part. And that was a much more practical approach than the other one. While I was on that Scottish tour, I was in an art college in Dundee that had a really great knitting department. And I was curious about whether I could knit wire on a machine. I didn't own a machine, so I hadn't tried that. So I took a little spool of wire up to the technician and said, "Do you think you could knit this on your knitting machine?" And she said, "Sure." So I thought that was just fabulous, because knitting is slow. I'm not very good at it. So I did come home and buy a knitting machine, but the knitting machine I bought was a giant one, because that's what I found. And I did make some things I'll show you in a moment. But a year or so later, a friend in New York called and said she'd seen this wonderful thing that she thought I might like. It's a sock knitting machine. And I said, "Buy it." And it's my favorite thing, because it's very easy to use. The big one you have to really haul back and forth, and that's very strenuous. This one you just turn a little crank, and it makes tubes. That's what it does. And mine, because it's a sock knitting machine, makes 2 sizes of tubes. It makes the size that fits on your arm or your leg, and half those needles make a smaller tube. So I have 2 sizes that I can work with from the same little machine. But this is a bracelet, and I put a machine knitted one inside of a hand knitted one to show the difference between hand knitting and machine knitting. The hand knitting is sort of irregular, but the machine knitting is not. But the large knitting machine that I bought first knitted big things. But what I wanted was a big tube. And so I figured out how to do that on this machine, which wasn't a tubular machine. But what it made was stuff. I mean, when it came off the machine, it just looked awful. It was just stuff on the floor. But I could pull it, and I could push it and pull it in different directions, and was able to make these big collars in the sizes that I like working with. So these are big knitted ruffles, but they're knitted on a machine. But I also could knit strips, and decided that, as with the leaf knitted forms that I did separately, maybe it would be a good idea if I just knitted parts instead of trying to knit a piece all at once. So I knitted the band that you see on the top, and then I knitted long triangles again on a knitting machine. When you run your finger through the long triangle, it makes a tube, actually. So I decided to sew those to the top edge and make these tendrils that hang down. So it's sort of an Elizabethan collar. It opens in the front with a brooch. But the knitted tubular forms I used to make a lot of bracelets. And as I was making the bracelets, I remembered that one of the things I had seen in Peru that I always coveted were metal arms, gold arms, hands and arms. And I thought, I bet I could do that by knitting. I never wanted to do it in sheet metal, because who would wear them? So I made a long bracelet, and I pulled out those sort of fin-like shapes. They're just stretched with my fingers, and then crocheted around the edges. And then I knitted a hand, or thought I would knit a hand. I knitted 4 or 5 hands. They were all awful, and I felt really bad. But I was determined. And somebody said, "Why don't you hire a knitter?" And I thought, what a good idea. And I actually knew, not personally, but I knew by reputation, a woman named Karen Searle, who lives in the upper Midwest, and she knits in wire, and she's a much better knitter than I am. So I called her up and asked her if she'd be willing to knit me a glove. And she said, sure. So I sent her the wire, and she knitted the glove and then sent it back, and I sewed it onto the bracelet, so it is an arm and a hand. And this one belongs to the Renwick. But here are the bracelets. I mean, the colored wire that came onto the market slowly was all based on industrial wire, which is what I had found first. When it became more interesting to artists, more colors appeared. And suddenly these colors appeared like neon because they were not, it's all copper wire. It's coated. And initially the industrial stuff is just coated once with a dye. But then the art market produced the idea that if you silver plated the wire first, the colors would be much more vibrant. So that's primarily what I use now because I love the bright colors. So these are 4 bracelets. The little teacup is actually a bracelet. The idea of those long triangles making these tendrils suggested to me at a little later time a jellyfish. And I wanted to make a necklace out of them. And so I figured out a way to sew them together and make a frame for the neck piece that went around the neck that would maintain the shape, and then added the liveliness of crocheted silver. So that's what, it's all an assembled piece, and there are little weights on the ends of everything so they stay down. But this is called a lion's mane necklace because it's based on a lion's mane jellyfish. When I knit tubes, I usually don't know what I'm going to make out of them. So I just knit, and then I cut them up. And I end up with a lot of leftovers. And these leftovers were sitting in a basket, and I thought, oh, those are too nice to throw away. And I figured out a way to put them together. So this is a neck piece that's just leftover tubes that are crocheted on the top and the bottom to make them stay in their shape, and then they form a necklace. Another kind of knitting that I knew how to do and explored in wire is spool knitting. You may know it as French knitting. It's, where you have this little spool with nails and a hole in the middle. And I had done that when I was a kid. So I made a couple of just using wire spools, which are quite small, and could make a tube that was about a half inch in diameter. This is just one long tube. That it's spiraled is because it's wire. It's knitted straight, and then I put a dowel stick into the tube and twist. And when you pull the dowel stick out, the wire stays twisted. And that, again, instead of making a fancy clasp, you just tie this around the neck. I made some really long ones, which you could wrap around many times. And I learned along the way that if I doubled the stitches, that is, if I took 2 wires over 1, or 1 over 2, it would make a different structure. So the bottom parts, those little knobs, are just double stitched on the same tube. When people buy these, I'm not making them anymore, but I would send them a dowel stick because it was better than having them send me back the necklace to fix. They are very sturdy and very strong, except if you step on them. Crocheting was something I didn't know how to do, and so that was something I had to teach myself when I was writing my book, because I needed to be able to tell people how to do that. And so the first thing I learned was chain stitch. And chain stitch is easy in wire. And I was practicing, and I thought, oh, well, you could just make something out of this. This necklace is made just with 1 long chain. As I was crocheting, I wrapped it around a big cardboard cylinder. When I thought there was enough, I stopped and grabbed 2 sides and pulled it off the cylinder and put it over your head. It makes a necklace. in order to keep that, I made those little pleated flowers to hold those places together. And I warned people not to undo the coil because they'd have to redo it. But it felt very good. It was quite heavy. I mean, if you're thinking this is just wire, so it's very light, it is just wire, but it's a lot of wire. And this one is 28 gauge. Then my big graduation in crocheting was to crochet in the round. I could make circles. And beads are something I've always loved to make, but I only like big ones. And so making them out of sheet metal is impractical. They just get too heavy. But I could make them as big as I want if I crocheted them, because they don't weigh so much. So this is just 7 big crocheted circles. They're crocheted on the front in silver, and then there's a color element crocheted on the back, so they're actually a double layer. And the tube that holds the chain runs between those 2 layers. In exploring crochet patterns, I found some books on crocheted lace from the 30s. And those were actually things that women who worked in offices wore black, and they crocheted collars and cuffs. Who knew? And mostly they were done with Irish lace, which is a very simple pattern. So this is Irish lace. It's done in 2 colors of 28 gauge. And then because it is big and needs a little bit of weight on the bottom to keep it in place, I forged some ovals and just sewed them to the crochet. Hairpin lace was my most adventurous crochet. It actually makes strips that have loops on both sides and the crochet patterns in the center. They're used for making really ugly shawls. I mean, if you find a book about hairpin lace, that's mostly what they make. But I found that I could, if I threaded one side of the loops together, I could make it go around. So that's what makes these medallion shapes. And then I just made a lot of them, crocheted them together, and filled the spaces with other crocheted circles. So it is a total assemblage of crochet. It's also a halo shape, because I really like that shape. I love the halos in Renaissance paintings. They're beautiful, and they have these intricate circular patterns drawn in them. But who wears halos? So I just took the shape and turned it upside down. The jellyfish that are in the title of my talk came about because I was at the Racine Art Museum. I was invited while I was there to think about doing their window project. And there are 5 of them in a row on the street. And they commission one artist a year to do something in the windows that will be visible from the street and will encourage people to come into the museum. So I don't remember whose work was in the window when I saw it the first time, but it was very effective. Oh, I know, it was Dale Chihuly, as a matter of fact. And they were just big discs, red, mostly red. So I said, you know, I don't do big things. I don't know that I could handle those windows. But it was a good opportunity to do something I hadn't done before. So I came home and I thought I could do a lot of little things and I can put them in the window. But I'll do one big one. So I proposed that I would do jellyfish because I knew I could do them in colors and that I could knit them all. And they agreed to that. I worked on it for a year. This was the biggest one, and it's quite large. The bell part is about 24 inches in diameter. The tendril parts are all knitted on knitting machine, so those were fairly easy. except for the one that's crocheted. That took a little longer. But it's all assembled with multiple layers in the bell. And it actually looks like one that was washed up on the beach in San Diego. And it was in the newspaper as I was thinking about making jellyfish, and I thought, oh my God, I didn't know that it could be that big. So this one is big. But then I thought about all the other shapes that I could make for jellyfish. And I had, these are called moon jellies. And I had seen them in a marina in Denmark where they absolutely covered the water. They're white, and they overlapped each other. And I don't know why they were all there, but it was beautiful. And I thought, I remembered having seen that. And I thought, well, that's an interesting shape, and that's an easy shape to knit. So these are, I made one window full of moon jellies. In the project, I made each window a different shape and a different color. So these were the moons, and they were mostly white. And these are pink. I did these as a different project for the Monterey Museum of Art. They had seen my jellyfish somewhere and called me and said, do you still have those? And I said, actually, no, they're traveling. But I could make more. What do you have in mind? So they had in mind to celebrate jellyfish at the same time that the Monterey Aquarium was installing a new jellyfish exhibition. And I was sort of miffed with the aquarium because they had not accepted, they had turned us down when we asked about traveling the other ones. And I thought, I'll show them, I'll just do more. So I said, but I'll do more. So I did, I think about 75 of this color. And it was simple because they were all the same. I just had to keep repeating them. But they made a beautiful school. I don't remember what you call a school of jellyfish. It's not a school, but it has another special word. And I just clustered them all in the center of a gallery, and that people could walk around them or touch them, because they're very lightweight and practically indestructible. Back at Racine, part of the contract said I had to do something halfway through the year. I had to change the windows halfway through the year. And I decided I would do corals that would stand on the bottom so that when you looked into the window, you could look down and see the corals. And I made quite a lot of these because there were a lot of windows and a lot of floor space. But they were really fun to make because as I would make them, I would put them on the floor, and pretty soon I was just surrounded by this floor of color. They are all tubular knit with just crocheted ruffles here and there. And then the last installation project I've done is called Flowers, California Flowers. They're hanging because they don't work if they have to stand on their own. And I thought, well, I'd like to try flowers, but I can't make a garden because I can't make them stand up the way I want. But I remember the hanging gardens of Babylon, which I had always thought very magical. Nobody knows what they look like. But the idea that they were hanging flowers struck me that I could do that. So I did a large garden of hanging flowers, which are made the same way as the jellyfish on spools, and then assembled from multiple parts. And the stems are all knitted on my knitting machine in tubes.
Thank you so much, Arline.
Oh,